Thanks so much. I want to thank Paul and Peninsula Peace and Justice, Dennis Moynihan, colleague at Democracy Now!, co-author of Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, and co-conspirator and writer weekly, our Hearst column for King Features, where we talk about the interviews we've done on Democracy Now!, and those articles are posted in newspapers, published in mainstream newspapers around the country to give people a kind of roadmap to another universe of ideas, which I think very much represents the mainstream of America today. Because I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, those who care about racial and economic injustice, about LGBTQ equality, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. I also really want to thank the First Congregational Church here for opening their sanctuary to us, Books, Inc. for working with us, KPFA, KRCB, KQED, all of the public media that broadcast Democracy Now! I see all of these places, sanctuaries like these, independent bookstores, public television, and radio, all sanctuaries of dissent. I don't think President Trump likes judges very much. Whether it's judges stopping his actions around the Muslim ban, whether it's a man judging his actions, James Comey, whether it's the media trying to hold this president accountable, and not only this president, but all presidents. That is our job. And to attack the media as viciously as he has destabilizes a democratic society. This democracy is fragile, and it's dependent on the three co-equal branches of government along with the fourth estate, the media. President Trump is used to being the CEO of a real estate empire. It is very different to be the president of the most powerful country on earth. Our whole country is engaged right now in a civics lesson, from kindergartners to fifth graders to the whole country. And when President Trump talks about so-called judges, and the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, talks about the second federal judge who stopped the second Muslim ban, in which they dropped one country, Iraq, and they forbid refugees from coming to this country from 6 majority Muslim countries. That federal judge in Hawaii, Jeff Sessions said 2 weeks ago on a right-wing radio talk show, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the president of the United States? From so-called judges to men in the Pacific, I think that Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions should pay attention to this national civics lesson that we are all going through. I also want to thank my family for coming out. My brother, Steve Goodman, my sister-in-law, Ruth Levine, my nephew and niece, Sarah and Eli Goodman, and all the folks who I consider family as we've come back here year after year. It is so wonderful to join you, to talk about the critical issues of the day. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death, And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Well, did anyone test this before I answer? So this journey has been quite an amazing one as we zigzag across the country. And we started in Denver, supporting all sorts of community media there. Denver PBS, Denver Open Media, Public Access, KGNU, a gem in the Community Media Network, and Colorado Independent, a wonderful news website that investigates Colorado politics. And we did it at the Su Teatro Performing Arts Center. After that evening, the next morning, before we flew out to British Columbia, we went over to the Unitarian Church, where a woman named Jeanette Vizquera had taken refuge. Jeanette is a Mexican immigrant. She's lived in this country for more than 20 years, worked hard, raised her 4 children, paid her taxes every year. And she was frightened when, just after Donald Trump became president, Daniel Ramirez was arrested in Washington State, who is a dreamer, right, allowed to live, work, and study in this country, and he was arrested. The shock that sent through millions of the communities of millions of undocumented immigrants in this country was frightening. So she did not want her children to become motherless, and she went into the church. She's a well-known leader of the Metro Denver sanctuary movement. And we interviewed her. You know, she was on Skype in the church, and we were in the TV studio in New York. And that was in February. In April, we went to visit her and see what's it like to live in the basement of a church for 2 months. How is she doing? How is her family? It was early Saturday morning, her kids were still sleeping, and she said, you know, she'd gotten a number of death threats. And I asked, well, what gives her hope? And she said, because she had gotten so many more, thousands of emails and Facebook posts, just expressions of support. And that's what gave her hope. Or as the great Isabel Allende, who comes from this area, well, originally comes from Chile, but lives in the Bay Area now, said, you know, author of House of the Spirits and so many other wonderful books, as a daughter of Chile, when asked about paramilitary death squad, she said, for every paramilitary thug, there are 1,000 compañeros and compañeras who are there to help each other. That's what gave her hope. And Jeanette sounded just like that. And then her kids woke up, Zuri, who's 6, and Roberto, who's 10, this wisp of a boy, this feather of a boy. They speak perfect English. They're American citizens. They go to the Denver public schools. And they were about to go out on a Cesar Chavez march that day, and they had a poster of their, I forgot to drink this, a poster of their mother that his teacher had made in the Denver public schools. This beautiful lithograph that, you know, really showed Jeanette's gorgeous Mayan features. And on the bottom it said something like, keep families together. And he was going to carry it in the march. And when he came out, Zuri climbed on her lap as I was interviewing her. And Roberto, his mother was sitting, he stood equal height with her sitting. And he had his arm around her shoulder. And he said they were going to go out on the march, but his mother couldn't because he was afraid she would be arrested if she went outside. You know, she would be iced. She would be arrested by ICE. And so he put his arm around her and he said, so I am my mother's voice. We went back to New York and we broadcast this interview. You can check it out at democracynow.org. You can see this beautiful family. And the next day, Time magazine announced its 100 most important people in the world. And Jeanette Vizquera was among them. And so she held a news conference at the church. She couldn't go outside, and the media had to come inside, and she held up her 2016 tax returns. And she said, "You can take a look at mine," and I challenge the President of the United States to do the same. So Time magazine had their gala in New York, and all the glitterati came, and John Legend had some choice words for the president, and that video went viral. And of course, Jeanette couldn't go to the gala. So the community threw a gala for her in the church, and that was 2 Tuesday nights ago as we were on this trip. And the next morning, Arturo Hernandez Garcia was arrested in the streets of Denver, another immigrants' rights activist. Arturo I met 2 years ago in 2015 when he'd taken refuge in the church. This was under President Obama. I mean, make no mistake about it, President Obama laid the foundation for this crackdown on immigrants. Even his allies in the immigrants' rights community, inside and outside the White House, came to call him the deporter-in-chief. He deported millions of immigrants, more than any president in US history. And so Arturo, in the midst of this, took refuge in the church. And he was there for several months and only came out when the Department of Homeland Security gave him a document that said he is not a priority for deportation. And he then felt, as a sign of good faith, he would walk out. He wanted immigrants to know they didn't have to live in the shadows. And so he left the church and went back to work with his brother-in-law. They had a tile business. He had worked here for over 10 years, had a family, his wife and his 2 kids. And that's what he'd been doing since then. And it was the next morning after Jeanette couldn't be arrested because of all the attention she was getting, that they took Arturo. And then when we were in Burlington, Vermont, my brother David Goodman lives in Vermont, and he is the co-author of this book as well. We spoke at the Unitarian Church there, and as I was speaking, I looked over and saw Zuli Palacios and Kike Balcazar. And Zuli and Kike were arrested several weeks ago. They're the leaders of Migrant Justice, a group in Vermont that takes on the dairy industry there to ensure that immigrants who work in the dairy farms, like 1,500 farms that produce dairy for, say, Ben & Jerry's, among other companies, are fairly treated, paid fairly, and have good enough working conditions. And here is Zuli and Kike, and they get taken off the road by ICE, held for almost 2 weeks, and I think it's really as a result of the tremendous outcry that they were finally released. And then last week, Juan interviews Karime Andujar, who is a young immigrants' rights activist, one of the leaders of Undaku Rutgers. She's a DACA, she's a dreamer, allowed to work and live and study in this country, well known on the Rutgers campus where Juan is a professor. And she gets a call from ICE, "You're coming in for an interview." And that is very frightening because you might not come out. And you take Karime, you take Zuli and Kike, you take Arturo and Jeanette, and you have to ask, is the Trump administration targeting, hunting down immigrants' rights activists? You go after the most high-profile people. What hope does everyone else have? But the response has been so intense, though I don't know if what happens next ripples through the communities, so the message remains, watch out. Last Friday, after the broadcast, we learned that Jeanette and Arturo had gotten stays of deportation. Kike and Zuli were released, and Karime did come out of that ICE interview. This is very important. And I just, before I came here, did an interview with Tavis Smiley, and he's going to run that tonight. That will be the interview for his whole show. And he asked me, do movements matter, given the extreme nature of the US government today? oh, I do think movements matter. I mean, there is no question that the Trump administration is moving at a great velocity to dismantle the regulatory state. And that's not a bureaucratic thing. We're talking about endangering the water we drink, the air we breathe, the land we depend on, and the communities that we have built for so many years, endangering all of us. It's extremely serious. But there are movements at every level of society that we must take note of. You know, just 6 weeks ago, before we started this tour, Juan Gonzalez and I have been co-hosting Democracy Now! From the beginning 21 years ago. We went downtown to a meeting in a nondescript office building, and hundreds of people were packed into this very small kind of meeting space. They weren't your typical noble activists who go out on the streets and protest. They were elected officials. They were local city council members from all over the country. They were state legislators. They were mayors of cities, towns, villages, and hamlets who are saying, how do we provide sanctuary? How do we protect the residents of our communities? It is astounding. Every level of society is mobilizing right now. And we need a media that gives voice to this, because that gives hope to so many. So, last year, Juan retired from the New York Daily News. I mean, Juan is one of the leading journalists in this country today. And he retired from the New York Daily News after 29 years. There were so many retirement parties for him. I mean, I was on tour, like I am now. It was exactly a year ago. And as I was speaking in different places, I was getting all these pictures. I mean, how many parties can one man have? And they would, you know, one of them was at the front. This is the New York Daily News threw this one. It was at the Francis Tavern, this historic tavern in downtown Manhattan. And I was getting pictures of Governor Cuomo leaving, Mayor de Blasio coming. They won't be, you know, in the same room because they hate each other. But, and then there was Senator Chuck Schumer. And I was saying, what have we done wrong, Juan? I mean, well, what has Juan? Juan deserves all the credit here, done wrong, to be more specific. You know, we're not supposed to be a party to the parties. We're supposed to be apart from the parties, holding those in holding those in power accountable. But then I decided that this was a great tribute to Juan, because these elected officials had to come to see with their own eyes that this man who had dogged them for decades was finally leaving the scene. Well, at least at his DN Daily News, he's staying with his DN Democracy Now!, and he's teaching at Rutgers University. At the same time, he was inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, the first Latino journalist ever. And the induction ceremony was in Midtown Manhattan. You know, New York Times had a table, CBS had a table, Wall Street Journal had a table, Democracy Now! Had 2 tables. Yes, we had the largest presence. We were all there. And when his name was announced, we all stood up and said, Juan Gonzalez presente. Juan was one of the founders of the Young Lords, which is the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. He was a great reporter in Philadelphia before he came to New York. And when he stood before the group, each person had given a speech, and he put the others to shame. He talked about his quarter of a century as a journalist, as a columnist in New York. He said, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. He said, "I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help." He said, "I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another." The words of Juan Gonzalez, which I think very much embody the mission of Democracy Now!, going to where the silence is. You know, David and I, my brother, who often comes here with us each year, we wrote our first book called The Exception to the Rulers. And that shouldn't just be the motto of Democracy Now! It should be the motto of all the media. That is our job. Our second book we called Static, because in this high-tech digital age with high-def television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that make history and create that static. So I think even the corporate media has, to a certain extent, found its backbone in the last few months. Why? Because they are being beaten so hard, punched so frequently by the President of the United States. And this hasn't just gone on since he became president. Donald Trump has used the media to build his support, talking about these failed institutions. And while I do think the media sometimes sounds like Democracy Now!, you know, we need independent media, it is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, there's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. And now you hear all of the institutions saying this. I hesitate to say it out loud, but I have always wondered, why doesn't Trump just stop criticizing the media for a few days? Because if he did, the media would wrap themselves around him. The establishment media has so often shored up the establishment. But, you know, just to preserve itself, they have fought back. Except when it comes to dropping bombs. Except when it comes to US engaging in military action. It's then, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican president or Donald Trump, the media circles the wagons around the White House. I mean, think of what's happened in these few short months. As Donald Trump, what says he's going to increase the military budget by $54 billion, and slash the State Department by a third, slash funding for international organizations. When you take away all the diplomatic tools in the toolkit and you just shore up a military response, you know, you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. What the media does is they applaud the US when it engages in military actions. Take the US military bombing of the Syrian airbase. 59 Tomahawk missiles slammed into the space. It's operating the next day. First of all, you have to ask, you know, these are Tomahawk missiles made by Raytheon. Did President Trump do it because he personally profited? Now you might say, oh, come on, that's a little cynical. Well, the last documents we have show that he had investments in Raytheon. But it really is important to know what his financial investments are. You know, it's why we need to see his tax returns to determine if he is determining foreign policy based on enriching himself or his business partners, his family. So tomorrow, President Trump is going to meet with Erdogan, right, the president of Turkey. Recently, he called President Erdogan, congratulating him on the referendum he pushed through in Turkey that would increase his dictatorial powers. Most of Europe was condemning this move, and Donald Trump called him to congratulate him. Was that because he just has an affinity for authoritarian regimes? Or was it because he happens to have the twin Trump towers in Istanbul? We need to know. And we need to know not only his finances, but those of his family. And I wouldn't normally say this, except that his family are his closest advisors, and his family are his business associates. So we need to know it all. So the US bombs the military base in Syria, and a number of those in the media say tonight Donald Trump became president. Donald Trump drops the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on Afghanistan. You know, a few weeks into his presidency, the bomb developed by President Bush. Bush never dared to drop it. President Obama never dared to drop it. And President Trump, within weeks of his inauguration, drops the Moab, what the Pentagon calls the mother of all bombs, with an air blast radius of a mile. And it was that night that a number of other reporters said, Donald Trump became president tonight. No, we need a media that starts with the premise, what if war were not an option? I mean, it seems to me that would signify we have come far as we enter the 21st century. We need a media that doesn't bring you the typical pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. So often turning to the generals and the colonels who may bring us general news without a kernel of truth. How? How? There are many people in the military who are the most reserved about going to war. They know the pain. But those are not the ones who are interviewed on television. The debates are often between boots on the ground or we just bomb from the air. That's the extent of the debate. But what about the peacemakers who are there to say, what if we do not bomb at all? Now, I dare say, I think that would take a media that when we cover war is not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers. When we cover healthcare, not brought to us by the insurance industry or big pharma. When we cover climate change, the fate of the planet, not brought to us by the oil, the gas, the coal, and the nuclear companies. We need independent media. Which is why it's so important to support KPFA in the midst of its fundraising drive, the first Pacifica station, founded by Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps in World War II and said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. Or as George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so KPFA was born in 49. KPFK in Los Angeles was born in 59. My station, BAI, in 60. First year of operation, running a debate between Malcolm X and James Baldwin on the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience. WPFW just turned 40 in Washington, D.C., and KPFT went on the air in 1970, and it's the only station in the country that has a very dubious distinction. Within a few weeks of operation, it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, and I thought that was a good song. And then they got back on their feet a few weeks later, and the Klan strapped dynamite once again to the new transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And then it took months to get back on their feet. And then in January of 71, this phoenix rose from the ashes in Houston, Texas, the Petro Metro, and they went back on the air again. Yes, it was covered now by the national media, and Arlo Guthrie came back to Houston to finish his song on the air. Now, I don't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act, and I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child, or an Israeli grandmother, or a native elder from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota, or an uncle in Afghanistan, where President Trump promises to expand the Afghanistan war, the longest war in U.S. history. Now thousands more troops are being committed. But when you hear any of these people speak, you begin to understand where they're coming from. I didn't say agree. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. I think that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back and build up our own that represents people all over this country and around the world, because the media matters. How we learn about the rest of the world is all too often through the media. Unless you are from a different place and you know that place, you learn about it through the media. And people in the rest of the world learn about us through the media. And it's got to be through something other than a corporate lens. It truly is a matter of national security. It matters how we are represented to the rest of the world. Which is why I want to talk about the resistance, the growing resistance all over this country. It started with the mass marches after Donald Trump was inaugurated, led by women all over this country, millions of women, not only in the United States, but around the world. It was January 21st, the day after the January 20th inaugural crowd that President Trump would say was the largest crowd in U.S. history at inauguration, despite the fact that President Obama's was 10 times larger 9 years before. But the Women's March, the day after, 24 hours after President Trump's, was 3 times larger than his the day before. And that mattered. And it happened in cities and hamlets and towns all over this country. I got reports from Vermont, the capital, Montpelier. The police closed off the capital. 20,000 people at least had marched in. They said they couldn't contain that many people. And this in Los Angeles, 750,000 people led by women. And these marches were in hundreds of cities across the globe. And then you had the protests around the Muslim ban, 1 and 2. Thousands of people just spontaneously going to the airports representing the best of America. And then you had the protests around tax day, show your taxes. And then the March for Science on April 22nd, Earth Day. Democracy Now! Did a 5-hour broadcast from that freezing cold downpour of a day in Washington, D.C. And the next week, 7 days later, in the same place in Washington, D.C., we did another 5-hour broadcast from the People's Climate March, which was the hottest April 29th in the history of Washington, D.C., and close to 200,000 people showed up just in that one place, not to mention all over the world. These marches, these responses at every level matter, which brings me to an historic resistance movement that was born on April 1st last year. It was the standoff at Standing Rock in North Dakota, begun by a woman named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who opened her property to the resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, what the Native Americans call the Black Snake. It was being built by Energy Transfer Partners, a private corporation snaking its way from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, taking fracked oil through North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, hooking up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans said no. And they weren't the only ones. Oh, the North Dakotans of Bismarck, the capital, said no. And the company respected their wishes. The North Dakotans from Mandan, North Dakota said no, and so the pipeline wasn't built there. And the Native Americans said no, but they weren't so lucky. And so the resistance grew. There were so many people that flocked to the Sacred Stone Camp, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard's, that they had to open one and another resistance camp, like the Red Warrior Camp, and then hundreds and thousands of people came, the largest unification of Native American tribes in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, the First Nations of Canada, and their non-Native allies. And they marched and they protested, deeply concerned that this pipeline that would tunnel under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, providing water to 17 million people downstream, could contaminate the water that natives and non-natives depend on. They don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. And this movement grew. The corporate media hardly paid attention. And yet this was in the midst of the 2016 presidential election. Where were the questions of the candidates? During the general election, the moderators of the debates, I don't exactly call them journalists, media personalities, not one asked a question about climate change, about the fate of the planet. But the people of North Dakota didn't stop. And we went to North Dakota on Labor Day weekend. Even that was late. I mean, it started April 1st. We were covering it before, but that's when we went to see what was happening on the ground. And I went with my colleague who's here tonight, Laura Gottesdiener, and our videographer, John Hamilton, and Dennis Moynihan. And we traveled to Bismarck, North Dakota. And what we saw was so deeply moving. Hundreds of people, often led by Native elders, walking down the dirt roads, the rural prairie back roads of North Dakota, often starting with a water ceremony. And they would hold up a glass of water as they were met by a fully militarized sheriff's department on these back roads. You know, these sheriff's departments, this one in particular, has an MRAP, has a tank, and people are tear gassed. People are beaten, they are arrested. I mean, you know the image of the militarized police department. Ferguson, you know what happened there. Summer 2014, a young African-American teenager named Michael Brown, heading off to college in a few weeks, is gunned down by a white police officer named Darren Wilson. His corpse left to bake in the hot August sun, hour after hour after hour, in the midst of his community. And the people rose up and said, "We do not accept this." And they were met by this wholly militarized police department of Ferguson and the surrounding departments. I mean, this is recycling in America today. You take the military hardware of Afghanistan and Iraq and you give it to the police departments of our country. Juan and I had Norm Stamper in the studio in New York a few weeks ago. We were just in Seattle at Seattle Town Hall, and Norm Stamper is the former police chief of Seattle. You heard Dennis talking about the Battle of Seattle in 1999. It's when we did our first television broadcasts. I was there with Maria Carrion and Jeremy Scahill and Juan Gonzalez, and we broadcast out of the basement of a church. And I mean, that was an epic uprising of the police. I mean, in the largest export city in the United States, you had tens of thousands of people, farmers and high schoolers and environmentalists and teachers and teamsters and doctors and nurses. Tens of thousands of people from around the world came together to protest the World Trade Organization, the supranational organization run by, secretively run by corporate bureaucrats that could pass rules that overturn the laws of democratically elected legislatures. And a lot of people didn't like it. And the police department hit them so hard, they ran out of tear gas. Norm Stamper had to send for gas from other states. And the rubber bullets, CNN.com was reporting no rubber bullets were used, while IndieMedia.org, and this was the birth of independent media, IndieMedia.org was showing the photographs of people holding handfuls of these rubber-coated metal bullets. And IndieMedia.org got more hits than CNN.com. It was authentic, and it was true. Stamper's police department arrested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And Norm Stamper was ousted afterwards, as he should have been. He now says it was the worst mistake of his life. He said, when we as police are that militarized, you are a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And he said, we forgot that these were our children, our teachers, our librarians, our doctors, our nurses. This was our community. And he now travels the country and speaks for police reform and says this militarization of the police is the wrong answer. You never know, based on a person's position, what their position is. And we need a media where we can have the nuanced conversations, where we arrive at new conclusions. It's the only thing that will save us. And so back to North Dakota, the people marching on the back roads, hit hard by their sheriff's department. Often the Native Americans would say, why are you just protecting the pipeline? What about us? We are your neighbors. We all live in this state. So we went there on Friday night of Labor Day weekend. And on Saturday, a judge was going to rule the next week. It was Standing Rock versus the Justice Department. And the judge said, okay, if Standing Rock Sioux tribe says that you are excavating our sacred lands, prove it to me. Draw a map of the area you say are your sacred burial grounds. And the Standing Rock Sioux complied, gave him a map. He gave it over to Energy Transfer Partners. Judges share the information with both sides. So the next day on Saturday, we heard that there was going to be a native flag ceremony on the area designated as their sacred burial ground. They were going to plant their native flags. And we followed them down the road. And they were shocked when they got to this area. It was a holiday weekend. They didn't think that Energy Transfer Partners was going to be excavating, but there they were with their bulldozers at full tilt, the very land they had identified. And they felt that, these bulldozers had been way down the road, that they leapfrogged to this place based on their own map. And they were destroying the areas they had designated. The judge would rule the next week. They would change the facts on the ground and they would make this issue moot, Energy Transfer Partners. And the people were furious. And they came up on the property. First it was a woman with a child, and then more women, native elders, and then men and boys and girls, and more came from the resistance camps, and they came before the bulldozers and they said, no. I mean, the bravery of this act, of just standing in front of this massive machine that is a bulldozer. As we were filming, I could only think back to March 16, 2003, 3 days before the US invaded Iraq and another part of the Middle East, in Gaza, in Rafah. A young American college student from Evergreen College in Olympia, where we just were on Saturday, named Rachel Corrie, had gone to the occupied territories to stand with others to protect Palestinians. It was her way of hoping to work towards peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. She had befriended this Palestinian pharmacist family. And on this morning, on March 16th, the Israeli military bulldozers were moving forward to demolish the pharmacist family's home. And she and other international solidarity movement activists stood in front of the home. They donned these orange fluorescent vests like construction workers wear. And they stood their ground, and she was crushed to death by the military bulldozer made by Caterpillar in the United States. And that's what I thought of when I saw the Native Americans standing in front of these bulldozers, how unbelievably brave this was. But this time, they succeeded. The bulldozers pulled back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, pulling back down the road. The guards pulling back down the road. The people moving forward until a group of guards unleashed dogs on the Native Americans, attack dogs. They were biting them. Even the dogs would pull back, and the guards would throw them into the crowd. They would bite their way out. We're interviewing people who were bitten by the dogs. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Ultimately, though injured and hurt, the Native Americans prevailed that day. They stopped the excavation. We posted online that night on Facebook the video. In 24, 48 hours, 14 million views on Facebook. This gives the lie to the corporate media. You know, when they don't ask questions about climate change, they say, well, this isn't what people are interested in. I don't think so. If they don't know, they can't respond. But they suspect. And when they do see, the response is massive. We interviewed Winona Laduke that day with the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Winona had pitched her teepee at the Red Warrior Camp. It's got these endangered animals painted all over it. She's a leading indigenous rights activist. And she said on the day of the dogs, Governor Dalrymple, the governor of North Dakota at the time, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama. This is not 1965. We are through. So we went back to New York, and we continued our broadcast, our investigation of what went on. I think our video led to the North Dakota Inspection Board investigating the use of dogs, finding them illegal, unlicensed, from unlicensed kennel in Ohio. That week, President Obama was in Asia. He made this historic trip to Laos. And at the end of that trip, in midweek after Labor Day, he held a democracy forum for young Asian students around the region. One of the last questions was asked by a Malaysian young woman. And she raised her hand and said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? No American journalist had dared to ask President Obama publicly about this. And here's this young woman who'd come to learn about democracy from the president, asking him about this epic struggle. And he held forth eloquently about the oppression of Native Americans for so long. And then he did bring up DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and said I'd have to get back to my team on that. And he came back to the US, and he reportedly saw the video of the dogs. And it wasn't lost, the significance of it wasn't lost on the first African American president. And so On Thursday, Governor Dalrymple called out the National Guard in preparation for the judge's decision the next day. It did not look good for the Native Americans. And then the authorities quietly issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but on Friday at about 5 o'clock, the judge ruled, and it was a routing of the tribe, a terrible decision. The Justice Department, Obama's Justice Department, prevailed over the tribe. I guess the lawyers were about to pop their champagne corks, but it wasn't 15 minutes later before an unprecedented 3-agency letter came out from Justice, the very Justice Department that had routed the tribe, Justice, Interior, and the Army Corps of Engineers, saying they were going to slow down. They weren't going to move forward. They were going to investigate whether there was Native input, whether there was an environmental impact statement. They were going to slow this all down. I mean, Native Americans were suffering from whiplash, the worst decision, and then, oh my God, did we win? I mean, clearly this was orchestrated from the White House. I guess President Obama had to wait for the decision of the judge, and when it came down against the tribe, they said, well, we're not going to go that fast. It was a very big deal. Now, on that day, I had gone with Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh, who co-hosts Democracy Now!, to Canada. We weren't fleeing. We'd been invited to the Toronto International Film Festival to speak after the premiere of a film about the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone, who said to young people, if you can remember 2 words, remember governments lie. And if you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. You should all see it. And it's about I.F. Stone, but it's also about new independent media like Democracy Now! And like, Matt Taibbi and Rolling Stone, so Matt was going up also. And I thought it was worth doing because people in Canada care about First Nations, and I wanted to talk about what we had just witnessed the weekend before. So we had this event on Friday night in Toronto, and on Saturday we were invited to the University of Toronto. In the middle of my speech, I get a text, and it says, "You're under arrest." Now, I mean, it didn't exactly say you're under arrest. It said something like there's an arrest warrant out for you. And I didn't know if it was a scam, except that I did see it was a North Dakota number. And it turned out it was from a North Dakota lawyer. So I am really in the midst of my speech, and I am thinking hard about what to do, and I'm also trying to speak at the same time. I'm thinking, okay, what does an arrest warrant mean? You're not going to automatically be picked up, but if you have interaction with police or FBI or border agents, and the arrest warrant is in the system, you'll be taken. And I have to go over the border. I'm thinking, could they stop me from going home to my country? But if I can just get over the border before this arrest warrant goes into the system, whenever it was issued. So, everyone was there. It was a group, not as big as this, and I just said, could someone call me a cab? And I didn't say what was going on, and I went to the airport, and I made it home. So, I didn't take this arrest warrant personally. I really did think that it was a message to all journalists. Do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we needed to be in North Dakota. And I felt especially we had to stand up for young independent journalists. If they saw us get arrested, us get in trouble, if they want to go and cover this epic struggle, they can't afford to go to jail. They don't have the resources. They don't have the institutional backing. And I wanted to prove to them you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. And so we returned to North Dakota a few weeks later, the same team, Laura, John, and Dennis and I. And we flew into Bismarck to call the bluff of the authorities. And as we came into the Capitol landing, the prosecutor announced he was quashing the arrest warrant and dropping the charges, as we thought. But he would bring new charges against me, more serious, for which I would face up to a year in jail. He was charging me with riot. riot? Like I'm a one-woman riot? So it was Friday afternoon, and I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, well, like, what's going to happen? And he said, well, you're going to be arraigned on Monday at 1:30. The schedule is all set. And I said, well, wait, Friday afternoon, Monday at 1:30, so we have time to cover the protests through the weekend. But also, is this absolutely a done deal? And he said, yes. I mean, yes, you'll be arraigned, and then we'll see what happens. So there's no human being that is going to intervene between now and then. I mean, it's just set. He said, well, the judge automatically, rubber stamps all charges, and then you go in for arraignment. I said, oh, there's a judge. There's a judge about it. He said, no, this is automatic. He rubber stamps all the charges. He uses his discretion after, when you go to trial or whatever. I said, oh, wait, could you tell me the name of the judge? And so we issued a press release with the name of the judge saying he had a decision to make that weekend. And the lawyer's saying, no, it's not like that. Well, yes, this is what separates us from animals, right? We have discretion, and this is what separates judges from the rest of us. They can actually exercise that discretion. He doesn't have to make this automatic. And so there was a lot of media attention. A lot of people called that judge, a lot of media. And we covered the protests over the weekend. And then, well, the show must go on. And we had to broadcast Democracy Now! On Monday morning at 7, New York time 8, which is when we broadcast Democracy Now! It then runs on KPFA at your time 6 in the morning and 9. And so we called in a satellite truck from Minneapolis. And we decided to do the broadcast in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail. And then I turned myself in. So we operated on church property across the street. And the backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. And so we began the show. And my first guest was Dave Archambault, the tribal chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, the 45th tribal chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, like Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States. And I asked Dave Archambault if he'd ever been arrested. He had been once, a few months before, protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, like so many Native Americans, not only from Standing Rock, from Cheyenne River, from Pine Ridge, all over. And I asked, well, what happened to you? And he said, it was a low-level misdemeanor charge, and he was strip searched, he was put in an orange jumpsuit, and he was jailed. I asked Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the reservation, had she ever been arrested? She was one of the first to be arrested, Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, because she cared about the health of the kids. Low-level misdemeanor, she's strip searched, she's put in an orange jumpsuit, and she's jailed. How much humiliation can a people take? I was at the airport in Bismarck at one of these trips, and I was reading a magazine or something, and a guy came up to me and said, don't think I don't know who you are. And I said, well, who are you? And he said, I was one of the guards at the site where they unleashed the dogs. And I said, and were you one of those who unleashed them? He said, no. No, I wasn't. He said, we didn't know they were going to do that. We were as surprised as you were, as everyone was. They hired different security companies, and one of those companies used the dogs. He said, you don't think I get it? We sick attack dogs on them after we've massacred them for hundreds of years. He said, I know why they hate us. Just think about that. Again, never assume based on a person's position what their position will be. So we did this show in front of the courthouse, and then afterwards, okay, we're coming towards 1:30. Hundreds of Native Americans are coming to show their solidarity. They're performing ceremonies. They're gathering on the church property. Police are gathering across the street. It's getting very tense, but the media is paying attention. I mean, the New York Times is calling, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. It's on the BBC homepage, Al Jazeera, Vogue magazine. I have to spiff up my act. And I get a call right before 1:30 from the host of, one of the hosts of North Dakota Public Radio, who's been there for decades, knows all the players. And he says, the judge is not going to sign off on the charges against you. You're not going to be arraigned. And we learned that a number of Native Americans who were charged that day, who were facing felony and misdemeanor charges, a number of them had their charges dropped. Never underestimate the power of the media spotlight when it shines in the right direction. I am all for reality TV, this kind of reality. So, I'll just end by saying that in December 5th, another three-agency letter went out, and the Obama administration was basically saying they would not grant the final permit for the Dakota Access Pipeline to tunnel under the Missouri River. They would continue to look at this, might grant rerouting, look at rerouting, or perhaps not letting the pipeline be built, completed at all. And then Donald Trump became president, and one of his first executive actions was to grant the permit to build under the Missouri River, which Energy Transfer Partners has done. They said this weekend that the oil would flow, but the Native Americans have launched this huge divestment campaign against Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase, and other financial institutions that have supported the pipeline. And they're trying to shine a light not only on the Dakota Access Pipeline, but how the whole fossil fuel industry works, how it's supported, how we all play a part, and how we can work toward an economy and a lifestyle that's based on renewables to create a more sustainable world. That's the story of the Dakota Access Pipeline so far. And there are many pipelines that people are confronting in their communities. I want to end by talking about, well, going back to World War II, when Pacifica Radio was born. You know, at the Climate March, I said there were these signs. At the People's March for Science, there were signs. You know, ice has no agenda, it just melts. There is no planet B. I'm with her, signs with arrows to Mother Earth, and a button that said science, not silence. So I wanted to go back to World War II, to a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians in Germany. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they decided, along with their professor and other students and workers, that they would issue a series of 6 pamphlets so the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. On one of those pamphlets were written the words, "We will not be silent." They had these distributed everywhere under cover of night, in marketplaces and alleyways and schoolyards. And then they were caught, Hans and Sophie and their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.